You're very welcome to another episode of the Corporate Governance Podcast, brought to you by the Corporate Governance Institute, providing quality education for the next generation of directors and other corporate leaders. This podcast is about exploring what's new in governance, how we overcome the obstacles and make the most of our opportunities. I'm your host, Dan Byrne, and I'm joined today by Tom Cullen, Deputy Director General at the Society of the Irish Motor Industry, or SIMI, and a recent graduate of our Diploma in Corporate Governance. Tom has worked with SIMI since 2001, and during that time he's developed a keen interest in how the motor industry is going to adapt for the future, particularly amid this mammoth transition away from traditional fuels and toward electric vehicles. Like many industries, the big question for corporate leaders is how they address such a strong challenge. How do they strategize and ensure the industry stays healthy and competitive? And that's exactly what we are going to talk about today. So Tom, great to have you with us. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Dan. Looking forward to the chat.
Great. Well, let's get straight into it. And if we could start with just learning a little bit more about you. So could you tell us, just give us a few insights into your career and a particular emphasis on your governance career?
Okay. Well, you mentioned that I'd studied the diploma with the Institute, which is great. And I'm signed up and ready to start on the ESG program now as well, which is, I got great value out of that, doing that. I'm looking forward to doing the next course. My history then, I suppose from business, I would have worked in the healthcare sector, construction industry, and motor industry. My studies history back to, I've done finance and accounting, business, information technology. On the construction side, I've done health and safety, and recently more in project management. So quite varied in what I've done, a bit of law and all that as well. So, and then I suppose from the fundamentals, I've a couple of board positions and directorship. So with that, those have led me to have that sort of natural affiliation with good governance structures. I'm very involved in sport as well. And I think in order to build any organization, whether it be charitable, non-charitable, sporting, business, that has to be built on sound foundations. And I think if you have good governance practices in place, you can build those very solid foundations. And then it gives you the opportunity to bring in the people and creative and the people then that can grow and, make the business flourish as a result. But yeah, I'm very much an advocate. I suppose it comes back to my core values, like from what my parents have given me of integrity and honesty, all the things you'd like to have, taking responsibility, accountability. These are all things you talk to teams about. But once you have those in place, I think you can really build good, strong structures in organizations or teams.
And this strong structure, would you say there's any particular moments or chapters in your career that fueled that sort of strong appreciation for good governance?
Yeah, I mentioned my parents and my peers. I suppose it all comes back from that, how you're brought up. And yeah, definitely I was brought up to respect things like integrity. I was at the time, it was probably done with a stick to me to make sure it was done right. But yeah, I suppose exactly. But having a good set of core values is something that I now try and instill in my kids, that you try and instill in young players when you're developing them as juveniles through sport. And certainly in business, you're trying to attract and recruit talent that have similar values, similar, I suppose, long-term strategic views about the world and about how we do things. Profitability is hugely important to business and providing shareholders with value. But I think there's other things that are important too. And I suppose since I've been a kid, I would take those core values as being really important, and they've now become, taglined as governance and inclusivity and equality and all the other things that are so important. So yeah, I think they come right back to childhood.
Yeah, great. So let's turn to your experience in the motor sector. You have a lot of years' experience there. It's a very important sector, got quite a lot of limelight across the world, and you've been in there enough to have seen, I think, the changes over the last 10 or 20 years. Would you have any insights as to what the biggest changes have been in the motor industry?
Wow. Yeah, it's at the moment we're going through significant change. I think all businesses are constantly in a state of flux or change, and it's up to their management boards and the people that are the leaders within those organizations to manage that change. But yeah, we are going through quite a significant change. I suppose if you look at the bigger picture and you go back through time and how transport has evolved, we had, millennia with horse and carts, and that was the mode of transport. And then the late 1800s, Carl Benz is attributed with coming up with the first internal combustion engine. But Henry Ford then, put that into manufacturing. In the early turn of the century, we started to talk about these new petrol engines that were going to change the way we do things. And at the time, strangely enough, there were lots of conversations about cost, infrastructure, reliability. People had used the horse and cart for decades, for millennia. So they were very comfortable with this. How were you going to build an infrastructure to allow for these petrol vehicles to move around? They were very expensive at the time. Only certain people could buy them. So it's funny now where we had 100 years of petrol and diesel vehicles, and now we're transitioning away to a zero emissions model, which is 100% the right thing to do. But it comes with significant challenges, as you said. So we are going through that period of massive change. There's no question about the fact that the end goal will be zero emission vehicles, but the transition is going to be challenging and is challenging. I can't believe myself how quickly the industry has moved from maybe only a couple of models of electric vehicles that were available in the market to suddenly we have in the Irish market alone, we have over 90 different models. So and that's all happened within a very short space of time. So the transition has happened very quickly, but we've an awful long way to go. But the end goal is zero emissions. That will happen. It has to happen.
And as you say, it's a huge, huge transition and a huge task. I was just wondering, before we move on, could you speak a little bit about where the pressure's coming from on the industry to make this transition? Because I'm thinking of the lens of someone in governance in that industry and the stakeholders they have to please. Where do you think that pressure is strongest to change to the zero emissions vehicles?
Yeah, well, I suppose if you take industry alone, it has a goal to produce something, provide a service, and make a profit and reward those people that have invested in the business. This is coming from a global decision that we have to make to decarbonize the transport fleet that is out there. So that's coming from government. So, and that's a good way. We've got significant targets to reach. They're very challenging, but that's what we have to go for. So at the board levels within the organizations in manufacturing around the world, they have to firstly decarbonize their production process. So there's a hell of a lot of work, positive work that's been done in that. We have to transition. We're in a period of transitioning away from internal combustion engines to electric zero emission vehicles. That's such a difficult thing to do. There are huge levels of cost involved with that. And what's happening at the moment is it's tricky because you need governments to build infrastructures to allow for electric vehicles to happen. You need then, the vehicles are becoming more expensive. You take in the additional safety requirements that are going into vehicles all the time, which are really important. As we learn how to make vehicles more safe, we have to bring in that technology. And then when I mentioned technology, we have all the technology that's coming into cars to make them more connected, to provide greater information, and then ultimately maybe to become autonomous vehicles where you don't even need the driver to drive them. So that's I don't know whether I've run away from the initial question there, Dan, but that's a massive challenge for any sector to have.
Yeah.
And cost is a huge portion of that. You want to do the right thing, but you have to do it in a cost-effective way. And you load all these extra costs on a business, and that ends up with the consumer. But at the end of the day, we need the consumer to buy electric vehicles to meet all our climate change goals, because cars are the low-hanging fruit when it comes to making that transition, and because transport plays such a huge part. But if you make the vehicles too expensive, then people can't afford to buy them. So that's the biggest challenge in this at the moment.
So we're talking governments from a pressure to change perspective, and then I suppose other stakeholders such as shareholders and consumers from a let's do this financially sustainably. Those are the.
Yeah, I think the major thing is for governments, in fairness to most governments, particularly if you look at the European market, they've invested heavily in incentives to initially kickstart the move to hybrid technology, to plug-in hybrids, and to electric vehicles. But there was a period of time in which you would provide those incentives, but as vehicle technology becomes more expensive, it's the time they might have decided that we'll do them for a period of 5 or 10 years, but that now needs to be extended to 15 or 20 years so that we get enough time to sell more of the new vehicles And it's all about creating the second-hand market, because most people are never fortunate enough to buy a new car, but they'll always be driving a second-hand car. Ultimately, if we didn't have to drive cars, that'd be great. Not great for our industry, but it would be great. But the public transport infrastructure isn't just there to do that. So we will need cars, and we need good quality, low emission second-hand cars.
Okay. And just to put this in a bit more context, would you be able to? Would you have any examples in other industries where such a dramatic shift has taken place?
Oh, I think every board at the moment is considering what's happening, what they do as an organization with regard to their sustainability goals, how they continue to manage a business that's profitable and yet have a vision and a strategic plan for how their business is going to affect society, and how they reduce their own environmental impact by decarbonizing their own production, their supply chains, their suppliers, and all that. So I think in terms of every business is facing that challenge, but it's particularly relevant to the motor industry, and we're almost like a leader now in getting this right, because the end goal is a must for everybody. So I think all sectors are going through it, Dan, but particularly relevant to ours. But it's important for us to be on the right side of history here. Like, we don't want to be a sector that resents or denies or tries to move responsibility away from ourselves. We have to take it that we are at the forefront of making change. We've taken huge strides as a sector in a very short period of time. We've a long way to go, but this is really, we can have a huge impact in transport on reducing our global climate change goals, or our climate emissions. So we've a big responsibility as well, and we want to be on the right side of that.
For sure. And with the added limelight on the motor industry, because everyone uses cars, I mean, they're so visible. I suppose the challenge is a little bit extra.
Yeah, I would say even if you think we as an organization would report in the media every month about national, international sales figures for cars, and you would get a few radio interviews after that, but we'd be in the media almost every day now, because there is some topic of discussion around electric vehicles, whether it be with the infrastructure, whether it be questions about other alternatives. Is it hydrogen fuel cells? Do we have hydrogenated vegetable oil? Is that going to be another substitute? Where's diesel? Where's petrol? Where's the movement? And that's a constant question that's been asked in the media. Where are we on this life cycle journey to zero emission vehicles? Because, as you correctly said, Dan, everybody has an interest in it, and hence the media coverage on this now is far greater, which is really good, because that debate has to be had. And the more we debate that, the more we come up with the solutions, and then the more people accept those solutions and they're happy with the transition. So it's a really important part of the process. But it just shows how, as you say, how prominent it is in people's minds.
Yeah, great. Well, I'm going to zoom in a little bit, because when we were speaking previously, you had given me a phrase that I'd never heard before called crossing the chasm. In this context, I suppose it describes the sort of more minute challenge of where we are now in the motor industry transition. Can you expand on that and just give us a little bit about what crossing the chasm means?
Yeah, well, it's a term I didn't know a year ago either. So it's new to us as well. What happens globally in terms of electric vehicle sales, and particularly relevant in Ireland, because we were very good at moving quickly towards electric vehicles. So it was an exponential growth, even though caveated by the fact of saying it was a very small part of the overall sales figures, but the growth was exponential within the space of 3 or 4 years. And and that has happened across Europe and across the rest of the world. We've had this huge growth in electric vehicles and their purchase. And then what happened was suddenly last year, the numbers started to look like that they weren't going to be as strong. And we wondered why this was happening. And that is a global phenomenon. Electric vehicle sales have slowed down. So we're moving away from the early innovator, early adopter cycle of people purchasing. Now, these would predominantly be people who enter a new technology market. When something comes out, they will buy it because they need it. So if you take people that live close to a city, might be commuting into a city. There may not be an evolved public transport system. So they decide, oh, I can immediately, an electric car would be perfect for me. I would save money on fuel. I commute every day. That'll work for me. So these early innovators, early adopters, some people they would find a way they'd be really interested in the technology, and they would buy into this regardless of the fact that there may be initial flaws. They may have problems that haven't been worked out. There may be infrastructural issues, all the things that come with a new piece of technology, but they will buy it anyway. And that's happened. But now we're at the stage where the market's gone up to around 18% of vehicle sales, 18 to 20% of vehicle sales. And now we're moving to the more practical, pragmatic purchaser who wants a lot more certainty about this expensive product purchase. And they want more certainty before they're going to make that decision. So it takes a while to get to that stage, and it appears then that between the early adopters, the early innovators, the early adopters, and then to get to the early majority, which is about 35% of an overall market, there's a lapse period, and that was I think coined by Geoffrey Moore as the chasm, and we're in that chasm at the moment. So in order to get over that chasm, to get to the early majority. After the early majority comes the late majority, and then finally you end up with the laggards who, they will really resist any type of change.
Yeah, drag their feet.
But that's the product life cycle. So some products fail, some technology products fail at this point in time. They don't proceed. We will succeed because this is being driven by government, global policymakers, legislation, signed up agreements like the Paris Accord. So we're going to get there. It's just there's a period of time when you have to get the practical, pragmatic people to be confident that this is the right technology. So we have a lot to do ourselves in helping to cross that chasm, as you mentioned the term. We have a lot to do as a sector ourselves to get that to cross that chasm and get to the early majority.
Yeah. And just for the international listeners, because obviously we're based in Ireland and we're talking about Irish figures, do you have any indication as to what that picture looks like across the rest of Europe? Is it broadly the same, or are we an outlier in any way?
No, absolutely the same. It's strange that it would happen like that, but yeah, some countries are a little ahead of the others in terms of this growth period. But no, in general, we're all the same. There's a global slowdown in electric vehicle sales, and that is as a result of this transition between the early adopters, innovators, and the early majority. Now, there are other things that affect that as well. I mentioned earlier that the grants that governments initially provided across all countries globally, those grants are being slowly reduced, and so that's having an effect. We've also got the price of vehicle technology is going up in Europe. On the 7th of July this year, there's a new safety regulation coming in called GSR, and that's a general safety regulation, and there's about 15 new pieces of safety technology that will come into a vehicle. It's a massive change. It's going to make vehicles a whole lot safer than they are already, including black box technology, which record data after accidents, that type of stuff. Really, really smart stuff, but that comes at a cost. So as vehicles become more expensive, that means less people will be able to purchase them at the new phase of the cycle. So there's a lot of contributing factors that are happening globally that are affecting the slowdown. But really, a big part of it is people just, the next group of people to come in on and make the purchase are a little bit hesitant to do that. And also we have urban-rural changes as well that are happening across the world as well, where electric vehicles, are predominantly taken by people in city areas. I mentioned the commuters, and then where you have good public transport systems, you may opt for electric vehicles as well, because the range that's required for your journeys, even though a lot of that is dissolved now as a problem, but still people would see, little range means that if you're living in a city, that works fine as well. But then if you're in any urban area in any country around the world, you're going to consider your driving experience is really important to know whether or not an electric vehicle is suitable for you. And it won't be suitable for everyone at this time. So, there will be different consumers will have different ideas, but that's everywhere. That's just not particular to Ireland.
Yeah. Okay. Well, if given all that, I'm just like hypothesizing here. If someone is listening and they're a director in this industry or one like it, and they are faced with this slowdown, and they got to do something about it, What in your experience would be the best tools and resources and decisions that could successfully bridge that gap to cross the chasm?
Yeah, it's a good question. I'm not sure I have the answer, but I have some ideas what we hope will be the answers. So it obviously takes all the stakeholders that are involved in making this happen. So ourselves as an industry, our suppliers, the government, we all play a role in trying to effectively cross this chasm. From a government's point of view, it's ensuring that the thinking is long term, that the incentives that are put in place are enough to keep people, motivated to make these purchasing decisions. I think it's really important that it's not just the money, it's not just the financial incentives, but it's also making sure that you don't reduce incentives, because if you reduce an incentive, that has a negative effect on the purchaser when they're buying the product. So it's trying to keep those for a longer period of time, as they are very good as they are. I think investment has to go into infrastructure. That's a global issue, because there's a chicken and egg thing. We don't have enough electric vehicles because we don't have the infrastructure. But if we don't build the infrastructure, people won't purchase. And that's the same everywhere. So we have to build a really strong technical infrastructure that meets the demands of the consumer. That's a global phenomenon, and we're all every state, every country across the world is probably failing in that. Even the likes of Norway, who would be the leaders in terms of electric vehicle sales, they're failing to get the infrastructure in place as quick as it's required. Now, in a country like Norway, they have special funds to put that in place. The difficulty is it's planning. It's to do with the electricity grid, and we should learn from them and know that these are problems that we may face, that we need to be ahead of that and make sure that we have a really strong infrastructure, that we have the right things in place to make sure that when people purchase electric vehicles, that they can do it with confidence. So those are things. I think there's a lot of negativity about the electric vehicle project, whether or not it's the right direction. This is normal at this phase of the product life cycle. So I think trialability is a big issue as well. Anybody who's driven an electric vehicle, it's nothing but a good experience. The so-called torque, the acceleration in the vehicle is superb. The drive is smooth. The experience of silence is lovely. So anybody who tries, so trialability of any product is really important to get practical, pragmatic people to decide, wow, that was a good experience. I'm bought into the technology. If it does what if it does what it's supposed to do for my particular driving experience, then yes, I'm now at the phase where if I have the money, I'm prepared to make that decision. So that's the sort of things that we need to do as an industry and a sector, and educate people, build the infrastructure, keep the incentives in place, get people to trial the technology. And then when they come to making that purchasing decision, they're well educated in it, they're informed, and they can make the practical, pragmatic decision that works for them. And it's not be for everyone, but that's what we need to do. Or we believe we need to do.
Yeah, we believe it, exactly. I found it fascinating in that I totally agree that the negativity around something like electric vehicles, you do hear it all the time. I don't think I've ever heard before someone come forward and just say what you said, which was, this is normal in the product life cycle. It hit me with a huge amount of context for someone who's following the development of electric vehicles, or people who are trying to run companies in the middle of it all, that this is just a normal phase. So to a degree, there can be a certain amount of planning done around it. Is that true, or is that normal in the sense that you still have to roll with the punches?
Yeah, it is true. I think companies are probably, again, I've mentioned the term low-hanging fruit, but companies are going to make this decision quicker than private individuals, because if you take any reporting structures, if you're looking at your suppliers, who you're doing business with, if your boardroom is making the decisions to be a sustainable business and to have an effect on climate change and to affect on the people and the planet, if that's at a boardroom discussion, then making a decision about your own fleet within your own business is one that's quite simple. You're going to buy low emitting vehicles. And then companies are going to decide that their supply chain, that they want their suppliers to do the same thing, and they will look for them to buy low emitting vehicles. So these will be things that will become part of the reporting process for business. They're already there. Like, it'll just become more prominent. It's there with in the corporate sector. It just hasn't filtered fully down to the small to medium sized businesses, but that will happen. So you see companies making that decision that we're going to have to maybe spend more on our fleet because we need to buy low emission vehicles. And so I think at the at the corporate level, at the boardroom level, at the directorship level, people are making them positive decisions, which is great, because if you take a 3 or 4 year, if those vehicles are leased, a 3 or 4 year cycle that a vehicle is in a business, that then will come out then of the business cycle and become a private second-hand vehicle. And that will create a lot of second-hand electric vehicles. And that's what we need for people, private individuals who mainly buy second-hand vehicles. So yeah, the business community has played such an important role in the early adoption of this new technology.
I had one more question based on what we were talking about in terms of the tools, resources, the obstacles. And as you were mentioning them, it hit me that a lot of them seem to be external in terms of the incentives and the pressure and on from the government on the industry. So the question is, I suppose, is the fact that there are so many external factors, should that worry boards? Is that an opportunity for boards? What should they do with the fact that they depend on so much external behavior to fuel this transition?
I think in all businesses there are external and externalities that will cause issues for board making decisions. But you can only control the controllables. So for the motor industry, we are way ahead of where we should be or need to be. A lot of vehicle manufacturers, are not required to make these significant changes until maybe 2030 or 2035, but many of them have done that already. Some vehicle producers will not have electric vehicles after a certain date, and that's way before they're required to. So the industry itself is moving very quickly in making the right decisions. And I think businesses in general are moving very quickly to change their fleets over to electric vehicles and to low emission vehicles, whether that be hybrid, plug-in hybrid, or the full step, and it's taken into electric vehicles. I do think in the larger transport fleets, when you're into the heavy goods vehicles, when you're transporting product, that's a little bit more tricky. It's much more difficult to get those vehicles to be electric. They're available, but they're very expensive. And they have to meet the demands of the company in terms of range, because a lot of those vehicles do large trips. So that's a little bit more tricky. The solution may or may not be electric. It may be a combination of other types of fuels that replace diesel. But the most important thing is that those vehicles are the most up-to-date, efficient, low, have very low emission standards. And it's important that, the newer the vehicles, the better they're going to be, regardless of the technology.
Mm-hmm. So in terms of the financial impact, then, does that mean that organizing fleets of new electric vehicles is still a higher cost now, but lower cost long term, or are we moving away from that into a standard lower cost model?
Yeah, I think eventually it will be a standard lower cost model. Initially, there is a cost. A lot of companies lease their vehicles anyway, so the costs are not as significant. Somebody else is, when you're risk managing that fleet, somebody else may be taking the risk, like the leasing company or whatever. So those can be managed into the financials. I think overall, the right decision to make is to go to low emission fleet vehicles, and companies will make that decision. There could be a cost front involved, but I think in terms of the overall strategic plan of any business, that's got to be part of it. And in terms of targets that are being made by government, this will be pushed and forced upon companies to do anyway. So it'll just become a part of the financial decision-making process.
Great. And I'm just looking ahead now over the next 10 or 20 years, and for people in governance positions in this industry. Now, I know you said that, the transition to electric vehicles will succeed. There's such a pressure around it. But in any case, there will always be, make or break moments. And I was just wondering if you had any insights into what the make or break moments will be over the next, well, pick your time frame, but what you think they're going to be for people trying to run companies in this industry.
Yeah, well, I suppose and I know the Institute has a global presence, but certainly the effect of competition from the Chinese markets. We saw it with the Koreans some years back with Hyundai and Kia. When they came into the market in Europe, they were disruptors, but now they're quite a normal part of business. And they're very forward thinking in terms of the electric vehicle space. So disruption like that will be perceived as a negative initially, but can become a very positive thing for the industry. So we do have Chinese. We've seen the USA have put significant tariffs on Chinese vehicles coming into the States. The European market is considering the same type of tariffs onto Chinese vehicles that they consider that might be subsidized by the Chinese government. So there's a whole piece going on in that. But I think at the end of the day, the most important thing for our industry is to make sure that our own supply chain is meets with the standards of reducing and decarbonizing the fleet and the production cycle. I think we're a long way ahead in that. I think we've got to be very careful ethically about where we take product for electric vehicle technologies in terms of products like cobalt and nickel and where they're mined. The industry's doing a hell of a lot of good work in that space. Hell of a lot of good stuff in terms of road safety. You mentioned those changes that are happening. Vehicles are becoming far safer now than they ever were before. We've got significant goals in that. So yeah, I think where cost is, like in any business, is going to be a big part of the solution. Eventually, when more of these vehicles are produced and we have competition within the market, we will see some reduction in pricing, and as a reduction in pricing, that means that it's going to be more readily available. My fear is that the low price vehicle, that the entry level vehicle, we're starting to see that becoming more and more expensive. And I think we'll start to see some people fall out of the market across globally because they won't be able to just afford to buy a new car. So then it comes back to being so more important that businesses continue to purchase their fleets, to renew those, that they become second-hand vehicles and they become more readily available as good quality used cars to the second-hand market. So we have an awful lot of disruption, all right, Dan, and a big challenges. But the end goal is the same regardless. Zero emissions is where we're heading.
It's interesting when you say all that. It sort of reminds us that yes, the transition is a mammoth task in itself, but while you're doing it, you still have to consider all of the things that boards and corporate leaders would have to consider anyway, like geopolitical risk or financial sustainability or ethics in resource extraction. These things all matter as you're already trying to change an entire industry. I mean, it's when you look at it that way, it's just a huge challenge.
Absolutely. I think most manufacturers, if you take what happened with Brexit, when the UK left the European Union, they're a large manufacturer of vehicles as well. They had to consider now they want to now be a large manufacturer of electric vehicles, and then to do that, you have to have the technology, which they have, but you have to also have the component parts for electric vehicles. And if you take those products like cobalt and nickel, and the ones that I've mentioned, they're mined in places like the Ukraine, in Russia, in Africa. So in order to get those products, the European Union and the UK in this particular example don't have access to it. So do you try and get access to those products? Like Chinese mining provides a lot of those products. Do you get those from those markets, and do you pay a higher premium for them because more people want them? Or do you start to try and do your own piece, look at new technologies in terms of battery technology that will not require cobalt and nickel and all those things? So these are huge questions for these companies at a boardroom level, because this is actually questioning their future sustainability as businesses and whether or not they can actually get these products to be able to produce electric vehicles, which are the future. So yeah, there's an awful lot of big strategic questions being asked in those boardrooms for sure.
And all while you're trying to bridge the gap over the inevitable slowdown.
Absolutely. And they're producing huge numbers of electric vehicles because they have to meet European global targets for production. And at the same time, they then need consumer and business markets to purchase them, because the production lines don't stop. They keep producing. So the vehicles will come out and they will go somewhere. So it's really important then that we get through this chasm that we mentioned as quick as possible.
So, Tom, I just want to jump ahead to the long-term future for the industry, and I was wondering if you could paint a picture for us as to where you hope the industry will be in the next 10 or 20 years. Will it have crossed the chasm? And if so, how far along will it be?
Yeah, I think it'll probably take us a little time to cross the chasm, but that'll be a short term. If somebody said you had to force to put a figure on it, you might say it might take a couple of years for us to actually get the production cycle absolutely fully running again as it had been at that exponential growth level that it was at. I think in terms of our long-term strategic goals, the goal is zero emission vehicles. That's without question. The vehicle technology we'll be using will be electric vehicles. So again, that's not in question. That's where we are heading. I think there will be a mix of other products, and the battery itself may change. It'll still be an electric vehicle, but it mightn't be using substances like cobalt and nickel. It could be a solid state battery as technology that's been investigated that looks like it has a future use. I think we may have other things like hydrogenated vegetable oil. We may have hydrogen. We may have other sources that will play a role, but at the end of the day, it's going to be electric vehicles. How long it'll take us to get there will be dictated by policy everybody has signed up to. We'll start to reach a time when we only produce new electric vehicles or zero emission vehicles. So that's very much within our view. We can see that happen in the short term.
Great. And what is your opinion on the current timeframes as set out? Now, this is mostly government influence, isn't it? Like, especially in Brussels and after Brexit in London. What do you think of the timelines? Are they achievable? Are we missing opportunities?
I think that the targets that are set in place, I suppose when you have a 2050 target, there will be things that will happen, like vehicles will stop being created that are not zero emission vehicles. That will happen. The difficulty at the moment is that we're trying to put targets in place without actually putting the right fundamental targets. So I think it's really good to have ambitious targets, but even for the targets that we would have in some European governments, we would see them as being unrealistic in some ways. However, it's important to have challenging targets, but we would say in some cases they've been unrealistic. I think you have to have a combination of things to happen for any type of strong target to be reached, and I think we need the government's incentives to stay in place. The manufacturers in the industry are now producing the vehicles, but we need, more importantly, that the infrastructures are developed, and that's putting a cost ahead of the vehicles, which is a tricky thing to do, but it has to happen. And I think when you get all that combination of factors in place, we'll start to see this growth at the levels that's required to meet those targets. But there's a few combinations of things that have to happen. The timelines are fine. This is where we have to go. We have to take the emissions out of transport, and in order to do that, we have to be very ambitious about how we do it. But everybody has to play their role.
Yeah. And my final question for you is: anyone who's listening who is on the board or leading an organization that is faced with some kind of chasm or transition challenge, what would be your 1, 2, 3, whatever you want, takeaways or key pieces of advice for them?
I suppose it's nearly going back to the beginning of the podcast and rounding it up. And you asked me about, where did my governance history come from? And it really goes back to having a good core set of values. So if your only values are about creating wealth, or if your only values are about the bottom line, then it's easy to ignore the bigger picture questions and to deal with the things that affect the planet and affect the people in the planet, and the things that just have a wider view. I think if you're choosing people for any board, or you're choosing any of your leaders, whether that be in sport, in teams, in business, whether it be profit or non-profit, that I think it's about getting the diversity within that board right. It's about getting the right people. If you get the right people and you make the right decisions, and you work hard, you will get to where we need to. But where we need to get to in the past was just about making money. Where we need to get in the future now is about making the right decisions for the planet, for our people, for our colleagues, for their families, and for that as well. So I think it's really important that if you choose the right people, good people make good players. Good people make good administrators. So I think just choosing the right people with the right set of values will help us all to get there.
So the right people on board to cross the chasm with all the governance challenges. Easy peasy.
Easy peasy. That's why we're paid all these big bucks to get that, Dan. Yeah, but
Exactly.
yeah, it's a brilliant time to be in this change. And if you're somebody who likes problem solving, if you're somebody who likes to be at the edge of things when they're happening, then it's a great time to be in this industry and in other sectors that are going through it.
Yeah. And as you say, this is where we need to go.
Yeah, absolutely. The end goal is defined. It's just how we get there now.
Yeah, Tom, that's an absolutely fascinating discussion. Thanks very much for joining us today. We really appreciate your time. And that's it for this episode of the Corporate Governance Podcast. Join us again for the next installment of the series. And in the meantime, if you're looking to expand your leadership career with quality education in corporate governance and ESG, check out the corporategovernanceinstitute.com and explore the many opportunities we have on offer.